to the conversation as we go. So we will, of course, invite them to join the conversation as we go. But we're going to be focusing today on thinking through what it would mean to build community resilience in our organization. And so our agenda, our roadmap for the next hour or so will be to kind of lay out the design process, the planning process, talk a little bit about resilience. What does that mean? It means a lot of different things to a lot of people. Some people love that word, some people not so much, right? And so thinking about like, what do we mean? What do we want? How do we want to talk about resilience in our community? We'll do some breakout conversations to dive into that in a little bit more detail so that we can have small group conversations. And then we'll compile that information and talk about what's next for building community resilience in Guilford County. And so a team of us will be kind of facilitating the meeting today. I'm going to pass the baton to Mary Herbenik, who will talk a little bit about the planning process that will launch today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Can I get a thumbs up if so? Great. Okay, fantastic. It's so good to be here with you today and have a gathering of so many dedicated and smart people in Guilford County to start thinking about what a resilient community might look like, as Kelly talked about. So we have a few months to take a step back and to do some vision casting together about what we want to see in the future that we want to build and taking a holistic view of it. It allows us to really get out of our silos, our individual silos, but use all of the expertise in this room to vision cast about what Guilford County could look like across systems and across structures that are in place right now. So over the next few months, and we have blocked out basically today through December 2021, we will be working together to create a vision. And that's what our focus is today, on getting input and feedback and building something together in a collaborative process. We will also create value statements to guide our collective work. So what do we value as a network, a Resilient Guilford network and trauma provider network? What do we want to guide all of the work that we're going to do together? And the next part of this is really about establishing some action teams to execute on the vision. And so we'll be doing some identification of root causes about why or what's working well and why we may not be aligned at this moment in time in our community to be resilient. And so we'll have some different teams and you'll all have the opportunity to be part of those. And action teams are a little different than typical teams. So we're really looking at and working on root causes from many, many different perspectives, and then working to address those. So we can see, we don't have a map for this quite yet because it's going to come out of our meeting today. But we may say we need to change some policies in order to become a more resilient Guilford County. Or we may need to think about some ways that we collaborate differently in parts of the system. And so that really gives us the opportunity to build upon the great things that are already happening in Guilford County and to really address this together as well and look at the gaps. So we'll also establish an action team structure and do some thinking about what teams would be needed, how often they would meet and when, the scope of each action team's agenda, and then how progress will be reported across this work together. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what we have and what we don't have at this moment. So we have a group who wants to make Guilford County better today and for the future. And that's something that we really, and that's all of you and everyone on this call and many hundreds of people who are not able to be with us today, but who will be engaged in this work as we move along. We also have a process that we're going to be following. So there's been so much great systems work done in Guilford County, and there are some processes that are laid out about what works and what doesn't work. So we'll leverage what we've learned so far. And then a deep commitment to listening, learning, and co-creation. So what does it look like to really put some of the barriers and structures aside to co-create something better together? We'll also tell you what we don't have, the answers. these are complex issues. And Kelly's going to talk a little bit more about some definitions around community resilience. And we don't have any answers at this point in time. Those are going to emerge throughout the process. And so I think all of the lived experiences that we have as community members and in our roles and in our jobs and in our families and in our other structures that we're a part of, all will come together to help us build something better together. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kelly.
All right. Well, thank you for that great overview, Mary. One of the things that I think would be helpful, just to kind of actually take a step back a minute and figure out, like, how did we get here? I think it'd be helpful just to make a couple comments around this whole idea of launching this 3-month process. So for those of you that have been part of the Trauma Provider Network, the Trauma Provider Network was established in 2010 as a group of service providers, law enforcement, and community partners to really create a coordinated community system for children and families exposed to violence. And so that group has been meeting to talk about service coordination at a direct service level since 2010. And what we heard last year in launching a survey and in talking to the individuals was that we needed to think about more at a systems level. And so the Trauma Provider Network is still, full functioning and working to coordinate the care, coordinate the services, but that we may want to think about how do we build resilience at a systems level and at a community level rather than a direct service level. And so that really is kind of the idea around, how could we help to fill that need and facilitate a process that's co-created by the community. And so that's kind of how we got to this planning process. We had hoped to kind of launch this earlier in 2021 and this process earlier in this year. And we also heard that people were very overwhelmed with kind of pivoting where they needed to pivot with COVID. And so we delayed the design of it until now with the hope that we can really spend time listening and learning about what would be helpful for Guilford County and co-create this together. So with that said, this idea of resilience and resiliency building, I just wanted to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about resilience. And when I say we, I mean the collective field when we learn about this concept of resilience. So if we zoom all the way out, zoom, no pun intended, but if we zoom all the way out and think about resilience, if we look just at a dictionary level, so these are some of the definitions that are identified in the dictionary. The capacity of a strained body to recover its size and shape after deformation caused especially by compressive stress, right? So thinking about how we change and shift when we're under stress, right? And a second definition, an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change, right? So thinking about this definition at kind of a zoomed out level, it really is how we, and these definitions are kind of an object or a body or some sort of, but how something shifts and changes because of what they've experienced. And in this particular definition, it's about stressors and adversities that somebody experiences. So even at that level, we can kind of see this shift that can happen due to adversity that is faced. One of the things that's important to know is this concept of resilience is not the opposite of addressing trauma. So you all are probably very familiar with this idea of building on trauma-informed care and trauma-informed organizations. And if you want to learn more about that, feel free to let us know and we can kind of talk more about that. But it's not the opposite. It's not like, the opposite end of the spectrum. What it really is one component of building a trauma-informed community, a trauma-informed organization, right? So thinking about it from that standpoint, it means that we have to specifically attend to how we grow it. How do we build resilience? How do we grow resilience? How do we create opportunities and build protective factors in an organization, in a community, in an individual that allows that person to develop the skills that allow for success in the future. So when we think about the American Psychological Association's definition, I listed it here, adapting well in the face of adversity, right? And so again, it's really that pivoting, that shifting when we're under stress, when at the individual level or a community, when a community is under stress, how do we adapt and pivot and build our resilience as a community to thrive in the face of adversity, right? And so thinking about it from that perspective, and really kind of clarifying that it's one component of an overall trauma-informed evolution. What we know from the science is that resilience is built, right? It's like a muscle, it's a skill, just like we might build our muscles in our arms or build our muscles to perform in a sport or whatever. Resilience is built in that same way. So that also means that we have to think about what are the opportunities on which to practice that skill and build that muscle, right? So resilience is built through providing opportunities to build those protective factors, right? One of the things that I think can make the conversation about resilience very complex is the fact that resilience is not a one size fits all. And we talk about resilience a lot like it's one thing. But if one of the key things that you take away from today's discussion is that there's different kinds of resilience. So there's personal resilience, there's family resilience, and there's community resilience. And these are different kind of processes. But just kind of at a high level, I'm going to show you this 3-minute video about kind of the science of resilience to kind of ground us and root us in what we're thinking about today. If you have any issues with hearing it, just let me know. We can adjust the volume. Some of you might have seen this video before, so if you have, enjoy it again. For those that have not, hopefully this provides kind of a foundational piece on why resilience is something that we can build.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual is developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in a child's life with positive things that occur with the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
Interesting way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals and circuits in the brain, the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
Okay, so if we know the so what of that, if folks that know how I roll, I always think about how do we use that science to apply it. The so what of that is, as a community, there's an opportunity for us to think about how do we collectively come together as a community to move the fulcrum, right? How do we create opportunities at a community level that can help to build that resiliency and move the fulcrum as it was described in that video? So when we think about it like that, again, resilience is different across sectors. So there's, just to highlight again, there's individual resilience, which are things that we build internally, coping strategies that we develop, our cognitive abilities, our sense of self-efficacy, those kinds of things. Those are individual level resilience activities, right? There's family resilience, and you know, how do we create additional social support in a family and build parent-child interactions? There's organizational resilience, and we've seen this, especially through COVID. But how does an organization begin to pivot when necessary, when faced with adversity, when faced with a challenge or stress? How does it adapt and adjust in response to that? And what we're really focusing in on today with the Resilient Guilford Network is community resilience. How do we collectively work together to build positive community experiences, expand access to community resources, build connections across community partners so that we can collectively address community level resilience in Guilford County? And one of my colleagues at Duke talks a lot about, uses the analogy of the stadium and this person sitting in the stadium. Resilience is not something that you either have or you don't have. It really is the idea of how do we build its capacity, right? How many seats in the stadium can you fill with resilience skills, right? And so we can fill, some with individual resilience, we can fill some with family, but we can also fill resilience and build resilience at a community level. And really, in order to do that, we have to think about how do we strategically do that and work together to be able to make the biggest collective impact. And so when we think about that as the backdrop, we can do this. We can. I totally believe that we can, but we have to work together and we have to work across systems and think about what do we need as a community to fill those seats and to build those resiliency skills at a community level too. And we totally can move the fulcrum, and it means that we can move it at a variety of levels. Some of us might be in organizations where we're shifting it at the individual level or the family level. But we also know that we can shift it at a community level, right? And that's really what this conversation is all about. Couple quotes that I added here. Resilience is not just about winning our own race. It's also about the team. We're going to have to build resilient communities. How do we create that in our community? At this moment of history, we need to get up and go on for the human race, not alone, but together. We have to think about how we tackle this together. And our own Victor Armstrong and the North Carolina Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services recently shared a quote in an interview that we did, that people can be as resilient as the resources available to them, right? So we know we can fill some seats at the individual resiliency level, right, of the stadium. But when we think about what can help align that person and help that person be the most successful, we have to think about it at a community level. How is this community supporting opportunities to build resilience and to support that person so that they can thrive, right? So that's what this conversation is really about. How do we move the fulcrum? Do we think it's necessary to move the fulcrum? And how do we do that, right, as a collective community? So with that being said, I'm going to pass the baton to kind of get us lined up for our conversations for our breakouts.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. This is Lisa, and thank you again for joining us. And we are getting ready to do our breakout session. Just kind of want to reflect a little bit on what we're talking about on today, and our focus being community level resilience. Community level resilience. We're going to have our breakout room, and there'll be leaders in each one of the rooms. That's going to be myself, Lisa, Melanie. Also, we're going to have Rachel and also Mary. So each one of us will lead the group. This is the time that you can speak up. We're going to go over these specific questions concerning community level resilience. The number one question is, what resonates with you about these definitions and the ideas of resilience? And what does not resonate with you? And again, community resilience. This is what we're focusing on. And the number two question is, what's missing? What doesn't belong in the definition? And number three is, what would it look like for Guilford County to be a resilient community? And what would be the same? And then what would be different? And what would need to happen to achieve this vision? And who would need to be involved? Example would be roles, organizations, etc. So again, the community, what does that look like? Positive school experiences, expansion and access to community resources, increasing connections, belonging. Valerie just mentioned on the chat, we need more spiritual connections. Well, whatever you can think about when we do this breakout group, this is what we want to talk about. You know how they say, hey, don't be mad at who's in the seat of presidency if you didn't vote. It's the same thing here. We are now giving a platform to say, when we break out, Be able to speak up and say what's on your mind so that we can come together as a community, become more resilient, and make this thing happen and put it into action, as Mary so graciously put together as well. So from this point, I'm just going to go ahead and let go. Kelly is going to break us all out. And when we come together, we will go over the questions again. Hopefully you could take a snapshot, be able to write it down so that you'll be able to have the information, and each leader will also go over it again to make sure that we are open for good conversation, and then we'll come back together again and recap. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to break out folks now, 2 different rooms. And you should be zooming into breakout rooms now. Hi, Tiara. We just went into breakout rooms. I'm happy to send you to one if you'd like.
Can you hear me?
Now I can. Yeah. Hi, how are you?
Okay. I'm great. How are you?
I am great. We just actually went into some breakout rooms for some small group discussion, and I can try to see if I can send you to a breakout room here if you'd like, or you can
Sure.
in on the, okay, let me see if I can figure out how to do this. Okay, all right, I'm gonna send you to a breakout room.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Hi, Leland.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Would you also like to go to a breakout room or do you want to hang tight?
I'll just hang tight if that's okay.
Yeah, totally fine. I'm muting and unvideoing. We're on record as well.
Okay. How long have they been in breakout rooms?
About 4 minutes.
Okay.
So we'll leave them till 12:40 or so.
Okay. Sure. Thank you.
Sure. I'll text the facilitators too to see how folks are,
Yeah. If they need any backup.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks. Welcome back, folks. As folks are wrapping up, I think there's a couple Zoom rooms that are still finalizing last comments, so they'll be zooming back with us in a minute. So just hang tight if you don't mind for a minute or two, and we'll get started here. All right. I think everyone's getting zoomed back in. All right. So we'll start report outs. Mel, I think you're leading this part.
I am. So welcome back, everybody. Hope there was some good, some rich, some full conversation in those breakout rooms. So we are going to just go through each group. Kel, were there 4 groups total or 3? I want to make sure I get everybody.
There's 4.
4. Okay. So each group would have chosen a note taker / reporter. So I'm actually going to start with group 4, and we're going to work our way backwards. So if group 4 would like to go ahead and report back, that would be fantastic.
Okay, that means I'm up. Hi, everyone. I was the official recorder on behalf of Group 3. So we had some really great conversations. I think I got, all of our major touch points. So my other group members, if I missed something, please feel free to call me out on it. So we kind of started with just an initial conversation about what we had heard so far. And one of our group members talked about how there could be a need for chaplaincy in addressing resiliency within the community. So she elaborated on that and talked about how it could be a helpful way to meet the spiritual needs of people in the community. So I thought that was a really cool and great idea that I wanted to mention. And then we went back to the Victor Armstrong quote about people are only as resilient as the resources available to them. And that led us into a conversation about sort of the systemic piece of community resiliency. And we talked about how it's so critical for that systemic support to be in place. And one of our other lovely team members brought up the point of it's not just on the burden of the individual to build resiliency. And there's almost this interconnectedness between community and individual resiliency and how the two sort of play off of each other. And then we also talked about, in speaking to what a resilient Guilford County would look like, maybe having more preventative care and measures in place and being proactive about meeting people where they are. And then we also had a great conversation about taking a grassroots approach to resiliency. So being more effective and intentional about with our outreach and how we disseminate information into the community. So we talked about maybe this will look like going directly into homes and building relationships with families and building, trust. Trust is a major part in doing that work. And, also allowing for vulnerability and encouraging people to, it's okay to be in this place where you're vulnerable and to accept help. And we sort of also kind of branched off of that of how, a lot of, family resiliency is multi-generational trauma, and how it's important to factor that into our conversations of, community resiliency and, how can we help both children and parents? And again, just a lot of overlap between the different types of resiliency.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Rachel. That was great. Good job, group 4. So I was trying to take a few notes from you so we can bring all of this together, all the groups. So thank you. I appreciate all of that. Group 3, you're up.
I think that might be my group. I confess I did not know we were numbered. So I'll just go, but someone interrupt me if you're actually group 3. Okay, so I was the recorder for our group. So we talked a little bit about the definitions of resiliency and how it seems resiliency as a whole is very flexible. So both being resilient is a flexibility, but then also the definition is very flexible. And so what is resilient for an individual may look different for a community. And that flexibility is good, but it also can make it hard to know how to measure it on a community level. And I think that's something we came up against a lot in our breakout room around how do you know if a community is truly resilient? How do you measure that? One person may think it is, and the next person may think it's not, because everyone's had a different experience with their communities. So, we talked a little bit about how almost needing to define resiliency for a community before you do anything else. And then in thinking about Guilford County as a whole, we kind of took it back to basics and stating that building a resilient community starts with building resilient individuals. And we kind of thought through about how you really see if a community is resilient after something traumatic happens. When something bad happens, how is the community coming together? Is there social support springing up? Are people coming together to help each other? Are people pointing each other to resources? Is there a self-efficacy, a belief that we can get through this together? Let's see what else we have here. We kind of talked a lot about how Guilford County as a whole has a lot of resources. There's a lot of information out there about, okay, how to get housing, how to get food, mental health services, all of these different things. But the problem seems more with a lack of awareness or a lack of publicity about those resources. And so having to figure out how to publicize that. Is it some sort of directory, or is it, something else? We don't know what that would look like, but that seems to be kind of one of those stumbling blocks that we came up against. And then as far as how to achieve that vision, investment was a big thing we talked about. So whether that's time or financial, definitely financial, but investing in infrastructures in the community, investing in additional resources if there's gaps that need to be filled. And then also looking at it from a holistic wellness perspective. So are there opportunities in the community for community exercise, community nutrition, community social functions, these types of things? Are they just a part of life in general in Guilford County, or is it something bad happens and then we respond? So yeah, I think those are the main points, but if I missed anything, group, you can just put it in the chat.
Thank you, Rachel, for that report back. And yours sounds very similar to ours. I'm going to go right into, I am the reporter for group number 2. And one of the things we started with was going through the definitions as well. And we talked about the plethora of resources, that we have a ton of resources, but the lack of awareness and the knowledge is where we kind of felt like was lacking a little bit. And how do we communicate and educate people on that? So that was one thing. And then we talked a little bit about thriving. That was one of the general definition, thriving despite adversity. So what does thriving look like? And it's of course subjective and maybe different for everyone, the definition, in particular to trauma responses or to a community as a whole. We talked a little bit about that. We also talked about how not only our county, but other counties are ever changing and transient, and it's hard to gauge what's happening in real life. And I can't remember if it was which Rachel said this, but just, what does a resilient community look like? And what is the true definition of that? Because for one, it may be very different than to another person. So using that to promote the community outreach is important. We talked about the definition of resiliency, and Leland came in a little bit later and mentioned just opening that conversation around the shared language of resiliency. Some people may look at it as resiliency as negative. So how do we turn that and flip that to make it more of a positive? So positive spin on resiliency definition. And then we talked about perspective in regards to that conversation and that language around resiliency, because what may not always be seen as thriving or successful to one person, it may be different. So talk a little about that. Question 3 about Guilford County. We talked about looking at it from a macro level and doing a more community assessment and how that looks, because Guilford County is so huge. We have so many towns, we have so many cities, towns, we've got areas, and each one has its own culture. So looking at that from the big picture and how, and schools, I mean, it just trickles all the way down to not only the city, the community, but schools as well. So let me see if I missed anything. Again, back to the importance of the definition of resilience and the root causes to get more buy-in, and how do we understand the particular initiatives for each group or each area. We brought up, I brought up the arts. So just knowing there's so many different areas and collaboratives, and how do we bring everyone together to get more buy-in? And I think that covers everything. Does anyone from group 2 want to add before we move on? All right, so group 1, you're up.
Hello. This is Lisa. And group 1 was Madonna, D'Amber, Katie, Jacqueline, Brianna, and Christina. And Christina was our note taker, and she's going to be our reporter. So take it over, Christina.
Thank you, Lisa. So I think there will be some themes that you've already heard. So one of the things that we talked about was with the definitions of resilience, thinking about community resilience, the need for the community to be on the same page about what experiences would provide that opportunity for resilience and how we are understanding that. We also talked about how when we think about the different categories of resilience, individual, family, organizations, community, that really that community is made up of all of those other categories. And so thinking about that community resilience, how does it relate to those other buckets? And then I think a response to that was that, maybe thinking about the gaps that individuals are experiencing and how those can be provided for with support from the community might be one way to understand those relationships and that interplay. In thinking about what it would look like in Guilford County, we talked about organizations and programs who were really lifting each other up and letting those organizations that do something really well shine and be known, and not competing. Also discussed the level of awareness that we have as a community, that we might not be in a place of resilience in some areas. We also talked, as others did, about a strong resource manual or directory and how we understand what is available to the community, and how those trends can shift so quickly. And then we discussed ideas around unification and how we look at this as a whole community. We talked about alignment and how there may be other organizations that are doing similar work, and how we make sure that this work is happening in partnership and that there's an opportunity to amplify efforts, which I think goes back to the conversation around not competing program to program as well. I think that's initiative to initiative, and how those various efforts can kind of elevate the whole county. And then I think the last point that we discussed was the importance of feedback, really feedback loops from partners in communities, but also directly from families and those who are experiencing various challenges in Guilford County.
Phenomenal, Christina. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Group 1 and Christina, and thank you all for all of the information, all of the discussions. And as Kelly had mentioned earlier, and I'm going to turn it back over to her, I believe, or Mary as well to close. But we're going to take and carry this through to Series 2 in our 3-month strategizing and planning. So again, I just really thank everyone for your feedback and information. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary to wrap us up today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mel. And what a rich conversation we've just had. We will get notes out to you reflecting the depth of this conversation as we look forward to what's next. And so we have a few other sessions scheduled for right now. We'll take back what was shared today and feed it back to you in notes, and then we'll build the next agenda off of that. So we are looking at October 6th, meeting again from 12 to 1:15, and then November 3rd from 12 to 1:15 as well, all by Zoom. So if you would mark your calendars, we would really appreciate your continued participation, and would also invite you to enter in the chat who else needs to be a part of this conversation right now? Who should we reach out to and invite to join in? Who's missing from the table? And if you just take a minute, and you can also share that with us after the meeting to make sure that we are gathering lots of voices from across the community and reflecting the great diversity of Guilford County. And I see Jenna put in teachers and let's see, healthcare workers. Yep, making sure that we have other sectors covered here. Fantastic. And we can do some outreach as well. Faith community. And the refugees and immigrants. Yep. These are fantastic ideas. So keep the ideas going in the chat. And I think I'm turning it over to Kelly for our final close. Is that right, Kelly?
Couldn't find my unmute button. There it is. Okay. Yeah. And so that is the wrap up. We really want to hear from you. We want to hear who else needs to be in the conversation. And we're intentionally proceeding slowly because we have heard repeatedly that the shared language piece is critical. and it really is kind of the foundational piece of how the rest of the strategy builds. So we want to spend some time talking and continuing the conversation about what resilience means, what does that look like, and then developing the value statements and how we begin to approach it. And it's something that will shift and pivot over time as we learn more as a community about the best ways to implement resilient strategies, and also as we hear from the community about what the community needs. And so we encourage you to stay connected to this process. We invite you to share the links that you'll receive as follow-up with other people that need to be a part of the conversation. And other than that, that is the end of the formal meeting today. Thank you so much for joining today, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional ideas or ways to continue to enrich this conversation. And you'll be hearing from us soon with the notes and the Zoom meeting for the next Zoom link for the next meeting. Anything else from anyone on the call that folks would like to share, announcements or any other information? All right, well, we are actually ending a few minutes early, folks, so take some time for yourself, and we look forward to seeing you soon.